Welcome. This is Signal. In the following story, the author, Henry Kuttner, wrote the protagonist as a male named Johann. It was published in 1936 in Weird Tales. I hope you will enjoy this slight reinterpretation of It Walks by Night. Joanne leaned heavily against the tall obelisk of discolored marble, her fever-weakened body trembling with exhaustion. The graveyard was a dim black sea, with pale slabs and monoliths standing in irregular ranks all about her. She fumbled with the slide of her lantern. The white beam sprang out vividly, etching the woman's gaunt figure in sharp detail. Deep shadows lay in the hollows of her cheeks and beneath her dilated, smoldering eyes. Her face had an angry flush, which betrayed the fever blazing in her brain. Fever that burned away lifelong barriers of fear and had driven her to this ancient burying ground where few ventured after sundown. For, as all knew, a horror dwelt among these tombs, an ancient horror that had come down through the generations. There were tales of a thing that walked by night among the graves, so that sometimes when men came searching in broad daylight, they found new graves opened, coffins ruthlessly torn apart, and bodies gone. Occasionally, one of the villagers would bury their kin in a cemetery at Kruchen, 20 miles to the north. But this was seldom done, since the horror had dwelt in the graveyard longer than the oldest graybeard, and the kind of helpless apathy hung, like a somber pall, over the village. Moreover, there was a tale, long ago, in the year of the Great Plague, when all the bodies were burned for fear of the spreading pestilence. Something had come forth from among the tombs and had burst nightly into the houses on the outskirts of the village. A dozen people had vanished without a trace, and at last, in desperation, the plague-infected corpses had been interred in the old burying ground. Thereafter, the village slept in peace, although now and then a lone traveler or itinerant peddler would disappear, never to be seen again. Still, as the older men whispered among themselves, it was lucky that worse things did not befall. But now Joanne was driven by a fierce urge that made her disregard the ancient menace that lurked among the tombs. She had come for her wife, Elsa. Her wife, for scarcely a year, had been buried while Joanne lay delirious, raving with the same fever that proved fatal to her wife. Believing her asleep, her cousin's wife had talked too freely, and Joanne had learned that Elsa had been interred in the devil-haunted graveyard beyond the outskirts of the village. Her beloved Elsa, daughter of the ancient Aubert clan that could trace their fathers back through Thurn and Taxis, the prey of a ghoul. The horror had lent Joanne strength to leave her bed and slip unnoticed from her cousin's house, pausing only to snatch her pistol and lantern. She now drew her weapon from her shirt as footsteps sounded suddenly nearby. A man came into view in the starlight, gingerly picking his way among the graves. As Joanne recognized Carl, her cousin, she thrust the pistol back into her shirt and let the light of the lantern flare out. The newcomer gave a startled cry, quickly muffled. Carl stepped into the splotch of light, relief on his pale face.
"Joanne, I thought, what are you doing here?" "Oh, You can't help Elsa now.
Joanne looked away abruptly, her mouth working. Carl put a hand on his cousin's shoulder, but Joanne shook it off impatiently.
It's your fault, Carl,
she accused, her eyes dark with anger.
You let them bury Elsa here, in this devil-ridden place.
Carl made a placating gesture.
What could I do? I told them you would not.
I know. The resentment was now gone from Joanne's voice. It was very bitter now.
Our heads have been bowed beneath the yoke for a long time. Too long, Carl. Elsa shall not.
She's been buried a week now.
You have no shovel.
It was true. Joanne had had no time to procure one during her flight. She said slowly,
I can guard her grave, at any rate. You can go back to the village and get shovels.
Carl was silent. After a moment, Joanne laughed mirthlessly.
Bring shovels tomorrow, then,
she jeered.
You won't be afraid to come here in daylight.
Stung, Carl responded.
It's not daylight now. Come home, Joanne. We can get Elsa tomorrow. One night won't. It's dangerous, Joanne. They say it's been walking again.
Joanne shrugged with a nonchalance she did not feel. She was shivering in the chill wind that blew over the neglected graves. Her fears, forgotten in her delirium, were slowly creeping back to torment her. But she pushed them resolutely aside.
I'm not afraid,
she growled, and moved forward among the graves, her lantern sending out a beam of yellow light that rested on the lichen-stained stone and the worm-eaten and weathered surface of wooden slabs and crosses. Once, she tripped over a fallen tombstone, half buried in the ground, and would have fallen had not Carl caught her. Carl began a frantic protest, which his cousin did not hear. Joanne was staring intently into the gloom. She took a few hasty steps. At her feet loomed the black gulf of an open grave. She sent the lantern beam darting down into it, and saw the coffin lid was broken and shattered, and the sarcophagus itself was empty. Even before the light searched out the inscription upon the wooden slab at the head of the violated grave, she knew what would be painted there. Beside her, Carl caught his breath in a gasp of fear. But Joanne merely stood silent, swaying a little, in the dank wind blowing coldly across her wet face, and her thoughts were a chaotic swirl in which horror and grief and anger were mingled. Out of her poignant grief and her horror, fierce anger racked her feverish brain with surges of red rage that shook her with their intensity. Under her shirt she felt the bulk of the pistol, and she gripped it fiercely. Elsa, her slim white body the prey of a ghoul. Suddenly all Joanne's fear was forgotten in her blinding, overwhelming anger. Carl was tugging at her arm. She turned to meet her cousin's frightened gaze.
Joanne, what are you waiting for? We can't stay here.
It's walked again.
No!
Joanne barked the word fiercely, her eyes blazing.
Elsa!
It's too late, Joanne. Elsa is gone.
Is it too late
for vengeance?
Joanne asked quietly, and at her words Carl shrank back, stark amazement on his face.
Vengeance?
He whispered the word fearfully, and a shudder racked him. He shot an apprehensive glance into the dimness about them. And then he said, still whispering,
"You are mad, Joanne."
Deliberately, Joanne drew out her pistol.
"Very well, I am mad. But Carl, if it were your wife—"
She broke off, her lips twisting, and then she resumed. Her voice was chill with inflexible purpose.
"Listen to me, Carl. I'm going to make someone, God, man, or devil, suffer for this crime."
She glanced back into the gulf of the violated grave.
"Go home, Carl. You can't help me now."
Carl opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. His eyes flashed past Joanne's shoulder, and into them sprang a look of panic fear. With a strangled scream, he spun about and went racing off, his footsteps disquietingly loud in the chill, empty silence. Joanne turned quickly. At first, she saw nothing in the dim starlight. Then, far away, she saw a faint movement among the tombs. There was a flicker of motion in the distance, where an ancient mausoleum stood all alone on the side of a little hillock. She waited, scarcely breathing for a time, but there was no further movement at the distant tomb. Carl's footsteps had died away, and there was not a sound to be heard. Joanne fingered the pistol irresolutely. Then she thrust it back in her shirt and hurriedly made her way among the graves to where the mausoleum stood on a knoll, pale and ominous in the starlight. The tomb was incredibly ancient and weathered, overgrown with a thick coating of lichen that draped it like gray spider webs. There was an inscription above the door, but save for the single word Maranatha, it was illegible. Joanne did not pause to examine it after she saw the great stone portal was open. With cold rage surging within her, she stepped over the threshold and sent the light darting about the tomb. It was empty. Bare, granite walls met her gaze, but there was a door of rusted metal set in the further wall, and this was ajar. Joanne squeezed through the gap and held the lantern high. She was in an empty passage, paved with great stone slabs, sloping down into the side of the little hill. A faint whispering sound, like the slithering of water over jagged rocks, was audible, and Joanne cautiously advanced. The passage turned and twisted in the rock, but it continued to descend steeply, and twice Joanne passed black mouths of side tunnels. Now the faint whispering was louder. She recognized the sound of voices, but there was a curious squeaking and snarling that puzzled her, such a sound as might originate from a nest of rats. The cold tide of sanity was slowly rising in Joanne's brain, and misgivings were beginning to assail her. But the thought of Elsa's looted grave enabled her to force them out of her mind. She replaced the slide on the lantern and moved forward in utter darkness, feeling her way and straining to distinguish an intelligible word from the babble and chatterings and whisperings that she heard. Slowly she advanced, sliding her hand along the wall. And suddenly, a voice sounded distinct and clear above the sly mutterings. It was harsh and grating, possessing a curious quality of depth, as though it had come from far underground. And it said distinctly,
has been gone long.
A wave of fear came rushing up to overwhelm Joanne, but she clung desperately to the thought of Elsa and her vengeance. Fighting back her horror, she edged forward. And as though at a signal, a sudden silence fell. Joanne caught a whisper. "We'll be back to bring us food." Behind her, there was a rustling, swiftly growing louder. In the blackness, nothing was visible, but Joanne flung herself against the wall. The rustling swept past her, and for a moment an overpowering stench filled her nostrils. She was conscious that something had passed close to her, something she could not see for the darkness, although she felt sick and giddy with its passing. She leaned against the wall, grateful for its support, and the whisperings and shrillings broke out afresh, this time with an eerie note of disappointment. A new voice spoke, a quiet, emotionless voice with a dreadful feline purr in it. "No food could I find, my ancestors. No food or drink. Must we go hungry?" Another voice whined, and a plaintive series of cries burst from the grim darkness that pulsed with unseen, horrific life.
"You must feed us. It is your duty. We are unable."
A deeper voice spoke.
You must fulfill your trust. Each of us fed our ancestors who could not feed themselves, and it is your duty to find us food. When in time you too become like us, unable to go forth and search out new graves, you will expect the next heir to fulfill her duty.
"I found food for you 2 nights ago." The other voice purred, and Joanne caught her breath and shuddered in the shielding darkness.
It is your trust and your privilege.
The deep voice broke in, brittle and harsh.
This is the curse and the blessing of our blood that knows no other life after death.
"But there are so many," cried the other, and a stifled gasp of fear came from Joanne's stiff lips. A taut silence fell, and the woman turned to ice. Past her went a soft rustling, almost brushing her numb body, swiftly dying away. Then there was no sound, only the charnel darkness that pressed silently upon her. And behind her she heard a heavy thud. Stung into life, Joanne spun about, and in an agony of fear went racing back through the twisted corridor, back to the open air and the clean starlight. She felt a heavy blow on her chest and staggered back, almost falling, the lantern slipping from her grasp and thudding to the ground. As she tottered there in the blackness, she heard the abominable rustling go past her again and fade into the silence. Gasping, uttering little moans, she fell on her hands and knees and groped frantically for the lantern. For a moment it eluded her clutching fingers, and Joanne felt the skin of her back crawl with the expectation of an attack. Then, with a sob of relief, she found the lantern, snatched off the slide, praying that it had not gone out. It had not. A yellow beam of light piteously illuminated the thing that had halted Joanne's flight. The great door in the tomb, the door by which she had entered the Cimmerian cave of night and horror. But now it was no longer ajar. she realized what had happened. The rustling that went past her, the heavy thud. The creature, Joanne dared not name it, had slipped past her and closed the door to prevent her escape. Breathing heavily, Joanne put down the lantern and examined the door. There were no handles or knobs. It was a bare, rivet-studded plate of rusty metal. She forced her shoulder against it and strained until her head swam, but she could not move the door. Again the swift anger mounted within her, and the thought of Elsa supplied the spark to the tinderbox of her fury. With rage and fear battling within her, she drew out her pistol, examined it to see if the moisture of the vault had dampened the charge, and slowly began to retrace her steps. She paused occasionally to flash a light behind her, but nothing lurked at her heels, nothing but the black tunnel mouths that seemed to watch her ominously. And presently, she saw that she was on the threshold of an archway that led into a silent, unstirring darkness. Twice Joanne went forward, and twice she retreated in fear. At last, she raised the pistol and stepped over the threshold, swiftly flashing the light about the great vault in which she stood. For a moment, she thought she was confronting an array of mummies, withered and dry. They were lying against walls in grotesque postures. A dozen brown, wrinkled bodies, some of them merely skeletons with wrinkled dark skin stretched over their bones. The floor was buried beneath a carpet of bones, ranging in color from crumpled black to shining white bones, on which the marks of gnawing were dreadfully evident. At Joanne's feet, a skull grinned up at her in a grim mockery of mirth. As the light gleamed through the tomb, a frightful rustling and stir went over the withered bodies. There was a monstrous shifting and squirming, and Joanne saw moving that should never move, and that should always lay silent and still and dead under the coffin lid. The things crawled about like maggots, blindly creeping away from the light. And Joanne stood there, the lantern in one hand and the pistol in the other, without moving a muscle or turning her eyes from the charnel horror before her. The light gleamed on cold, shiny eyes staring at her speculatively. Behind her came the rustling, and Joanne swung about, her light stabbing through the darkness. Down the passage, a vague figure was moving toward her, slowly, implacably. Behind her came an outburst of abominable squeakings and whistlings. Joanne jerked up her pistol, the thought of Elsa steadying her hand. She would wait until the thing was almost upon her, and then... But her fear betrayed her. The crash of the explosion sent sharp echoes rolling through the vault. The dreadful form did not pause. It glided onward, silently, save for the rustling of garments, and Joanne took a step back. Something clutched at her ankle, and in a frenzy of fear she kicked free. For a second she had turned her back on the half-seen figure that was inexorably drawing nearer. And when she swung about, it was almost upon her. There was no time to reload the pistol. Joanne flung up her arm as though the lantern had been a weapon. And two things happened simultaneously. The purring, gloating voice came from the dim form, and it said triumphantly, "We shall not go hungry." And the light revealed the face of the approaching horror. And Joanne dropped the lantern and began to scream over and over.
Elsa! Elsa!